Welcome to Property Law, Class 2. This is video number 1, the introduction. Let's start with a quick review of what we learned in class number 1. We discussed why we should have private property. We looked at the 5 legal theories that justified private property ownership. We also discussed 3 different categorizations of property: common property, collective property, and private property, and we differentiated between the 3. We said that this class focuses primarily on laws that govern private property. We also discussed the law of capture. This class, we are going to build on the concepts that we learned last class. We're going to do that by defining property in more depth. So we're going to talk about how we define property. We're also going to discuss how we create interests in private property. Finally, we're going to build on our definition of property by discussing the rights that flow from property. So we're going to focus particularly on the right to transfer property in this class, taking up the additional rights in subsequent classes. So at the completion of Class 2's material, I expect you to be able to identify legal issues related to the right to transfer property and to apply the general rules of property transfer to a fact pattern. That is what I expect that you should be able to accomplish after completing the materials in Lecture 2. So let's start with the higher order concept of property. Previously, we defined private property as a particular thing that's owned by a particular person. I want to focus on this idea of ownership. Let's talk about what ownership really is. Ownership can be thought of as a relationship between the person and the thing. So you can compare that relationship to relationships between humans. You have different types of relationships. You have relationships between siblings, relationships between parents and child, relationships between boyfriends and girlfriends, relationships between husbands and wives. So humans can have different relationships with one another. They can also have different types of relationships with property. And just like the different types of relationships between humans having different legal rights associated with them, the same goes for property. So the type of relationship you have can help you identify the types of legal rights that flow from that relationship. Traditionally, that relationship has been defined by this idea of a bundle of sticks. It's an analogy that's very commonly used in property law. And while it has recently come under scrutiny for, not very accurately representing the relationship, it has educational benefit and use. So we're going to stick with it for now. So that bundle of sticks represents all the different types of rights that could characterize an individual's relationship with. Defining property as a bundle of sticks or a bundle of rights. If you think of property as a bundle of rights, then those rights would include the right to transfer, also known as the right of alienability, the right to exclude, usually other persons, from using that private property, the right to use. That right comes usually with little societal constraints if you're dealing with private property. And then there is a right to destroy the property. What are the implications of this particular bundle of rights? Well, First of all, it shows you that property rights are defined by government and they're not natural law. They represent something that we can think of, it's often referred to as legal positivism. Now, I want you to hold on that thought. We're going to watch a couple of short videos in a little bit that go into detail on the difference between natural law and legal positivism. Another implication is that property rights can be divided among many people. So each of that bundle in that bundle of stakes can be given to another person. So all of the bundle of stakes don't have to go to one individual. We're going to talk about what that division looks like and how we characterize those divisions. Property rights also may change as society evolves, because if property rights are defined by the government, then the government can change the definition of property. So, or the rights that go along with property. So, for example, once airplanes were invented, there had to be a limitation on how much airspace was considered as property of the landowner. If we considered it private property, then airplanes would never be able to fly through the airspace. Now, before we go into the details of the case that we're going to discuss, which goes over the right to transfer, I want to talk a little bit about how property rights are acquired. So far, we have encountered a few different ways that property rights are acquired, but we haven't explicitly discussed them, so I wanted to take a moment to do that. As we saw in the last class, capture is one method that property rights can be acquired. So capture, or being the first to possess, is a way to acquire rights, property rights. Another is through creation. If the property is created by someone, then the law typically assigns to that person property rights along with that creation. The third is through accession. Accession is when someone adds value to a property, and that's usually added through either labor or adding new material. When there is accession, the law usually assigns some property rights to the person who invested the labor or added the new materials to the property. Now, we're going to watch a short video that goes over one of the seminal cases on the right to transfer, Johnson v. McIntosh. And before you watch the video, which summarizes the majority's opinion, I'm going to give you some background information that I think is particularly relevant. First, a little bit of institutional political history. When this decision was rendered, the Supreme Court was struggling to achieve institutional legitimacy. What do I mean by that? Well, when we talk about power in between the three branches of government, what power does the Supreme Court really have? Well, the Supreme Court has the powers to interpret laws and to determine the constitutionality of actions by the other two branches. But let's say the court exercises that power and renders a judgment. How does the court make sure that that judgment is enforced? Well, they rely on the executive branch to enforce it. What if the executive branch does not? Well, then we have a problem, right? The Supreme Court at this period in our history was worried about the executive branch not enforcing their orders, and they were still struggling to achieve institutional legitimacy. Now, this case also deals with some issues that were related to public policy. There were some public policy issues, considerations There were also other underlying reasons and motivations that may have influenced the court. So I want you, when you're listening to this next video, to think about the court's stated reasons for ruling in the way that they did versus their hidden reasons or their motivations for ruling in that matter. Because I'm going to ask you to compare the two and to try to think of some of the hidden motivations that may have motivated the court. I also want you to think about why the court didn't just apply a first-in-time rule of some sort that gave Native Americans absolute rights, aka all the bundles, all the sticks in the bundle, uh, because they were the first ones to occupy the land. So again, here, when you answer this question, I want you to think about both the court's stated reasons versus their hidden reasons or motivations.